My name is Tariq Masood. I'm the faculty director of the Middle East Initiative at the Kennedy School of Government, and it's my tremendous pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's event. 10 years ago, on January 25th, 2011, hundreds and then thousands of Egyptians descended upon Tahrir Square in Cairo and upon the squares and streets of other cities in that country to call for bread, freedom, and social justice, عيش حرية وعدالة اجتماعية, and to demand an end to the brutality of their country's police. 18 days later, those thousands had grown to millions, and together they compelled their country's long-ruling dictator, Mohammed Hosni Mubarak, to resign his office and to flee to his seaside retreat, eventually to face trial for his misdeeds. Today, a decade from that event, it's hard to believe that any of those things actually happened. The man whom millions of Egyptians rose up to overthrow, Mubarak, eventually walked free and passed away peacefully in his bed. In contrast, his successor, a man whom millions of Egyptians lined up to elect, died ingloriously in prison. And the democracy for which so many Egyptians fought and died has been excised from the national agenda by a government that is, by many accounts, more repressive than the one against which Egyptians rose up those 10 long years ago. What happened? Why did Egypt's democratic experiment come so spectacularly undone? This is a question we've spent a lot of time grappling with here at the Middle East Initiative, and it's one that I expect will occupy scholars, practitioners, and activists for decades to come. It's also a question that has received a fresh and convincing new answer from today's guest, and that is Professor Elizabeth Nugent. She is an assistant professor of political science at Yale's University, and she works on the politics of authoritarianism and political psychology in the Middle East. She has published widely in our top journals, including World Politics, the American Journal of Political Science, Comparative Political Studies, the Journal of Conflict Resolution, Middle East Law and Governance, and many other places. She received her doctorate from Princeton University, her BA and MA from Georgetown, and to crown that list of august institutions, she spent a year as a postdoctoral fellow at a small, earnest program called the Middle East Initiative at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. And
the Yale of Boston, really.
The Yale of Boston. As a Yale PhD, I will not take umbrage at that. She's with us today to talk about her new Princeton University Press book entitled After Repression, How Polarization Derails Democratic Transition. And this book offers one of the most novel and rigorous and beautifully crafted explanations available to us of what went wrong in Egypt and what went right in Tunisia, the one country to make something of the Arab Spring. She'll talk today about the core argument and evidence from that remarkable book, after which she and I will talk for a little bit. And then after she's tired of my questions, we'll open it up to yours. So with that, let me turn it over to Professor Elizabeth Nugent.
Great. Thank you so much for the opportunity, for that very generous introduction, and for the opportunity to present this work. I benefited tremendously from my year at the Middle East Initiative. You know, now that I have been an assistant professor for a few years, you have no time to write. So, you know, without that year, I wouldn't have really been able to make as much progress and get this book out. And I'm indebted to Tariq, to Julia, who's also here. And I also think, you know, for those of you who have been lucky enough to experience the MEI community, it was still one of the best experiences I've had in terms of an intellectually challenging and supportive environment. So thank you so much for all of what MEI has put into making this book what it is. So today, as Tariq mentioned, I'm going to go through the main empirical evidence and the main motivation and theory for the book. There's a lab experiment that I include. There are some shadow case studies that I'm happy to talk about. I have those slides, but confirm the main theory that I'm going to put forward in more observational work. And I'm, again, happy to talk about that. I have the slides if you're interested. And then before I turn to Tarek to, talk more about some of my argument, I want to highlight the takeaway and implication that I think matters not only for these two cases and making sense of the Arab Spring, but also, thinking about how political psychology can help us understand democratic transitions. So as Tarek mentioned, it was very Egyptian to start the Arab Spring in Egypt, but it actually started in Tunisia in December 2010. Mohamed Bouazizi, a street vendor, in reaction to police corruption, self-immolated and inspired a wave of protests that within 3 weeks ousted Ben Ali, who had been in power since 1987. Meanwhile, in Egypt, protests get kicked off on January 25th, 2011, inspired by Tunisia. They're much larger than anticipated on National Police Day. 18 days later, Hosni Mubarak, who had been in power since 1981, also resigns. So these are two of the first movers in the Arab Spring. Even though most cases don't end up seeing much democratization, almost every country witnessed, relative to that country's prior mobilization, unprecedented levels of protest mobilization. So initially, while there are a lot of differences across these cases, and I have a feeling Tarek and I will get into some of these in the Q&A, there were a number of initial similarities in these transitions that might suggest that they should have gone very similarly. So first, both of these long ruling authoritarian presidents who had come to power in the 1980s resign. The former opposition, here we have both secular and Islamist politicians, are now put in charge of the transition. That's not to say the ruling party in the old regime wasn't there, but they certainly weren't calling the shots. In addition, we're talking about Middle Eastern countries, so there's a specific religious secular cleavage that may or may not be, empirically more difficult to overcome than in other places. And in both contests at these first constituent elections, Islamists win very similar percentages. However, within 3 years, we end up with Egypt and Tunisia in vastly different places in terms of democratic transition. So in Tunisia, by January 2014, and after a lot of fits and starts, including some particularly terrifying national security issues where some leftist politicians were assassinated, Tunisia ends up with a new constitution within 3 years of ousting the dictator. And what's important about this constitution is not just that it gets passed, but it has compromise and contributions from all the major parties that you would need for this thing to succeed as a new constitution. This paves the way for parliamentary elections in October 2014. And then in February 2015, there's a peaceful transfer of power from the National Constituent Assembly, where Islamists were at the head of a troika government, to a secular group. And I will return to this at the end of the talk. Tunisia, despite a lot of challenges, is still on the path, as bumpy as it may be, towards democratic consolidation. Meanwhile, in Egypt, things go very differently and much more poorly. By December 2012, we have essentially a constitutional failure. There's a constitution that's pushed through and it's passed, but in a very low turnout referendum. And it's a constitution that's very much dominated by one side of the opposition, the Muslim Brotherhood. This paves the way for a coup in July 2013 on the 1-year anniversary of Mohamed Morsi coming to power. And in July 2014, the current president of Egypt, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, is elected. And as I'll return again at the end of the talk, authoritarian retrenchment is very much the name of the game. Although, scholars like Bruce Hoffman have suggested that perhaps we're talking about even a different kind of authoritarianism, not just worse authoritarianism than Mubarak. So in trying to make sense of this, as a doctoral student, I looked at the massive literature on transitions, most of which had been updated during the third wave of democratization. And one thing that stuck out to me was this concept of polarization, that it was extremely important for those elite decisions that constitute contingency, and we know that's important for transitions. But there were a couple of things that were missing from this, right? So where did this polarization come from? What kind of polarization matters? For those of you familiar with more of the American and political psychology approach to this, that we have both affective and preference polarization. And looking at that literature and thinking about how it applied to the Arab Spring cases, it became abundantly clear to me that Egypt and Tunisia were very differently polarized, both in affect and in preferences in 2011. So the more, I guess, academic question that guided my inquiry was, why do authoritarian regimes become more or less polarized over time, with implications for their transitions? And again, I'm looking both at affect and preference polarization. The way I refer to this in the book has to do with the extent to which groups dislike each other and the extent to which they disagree with each other, both of which are really important, right, for thinking about these contingent moments of democratization. The existing explanations that I looked to didn't seem to explain the bulk of the difference between Egypt and Tunisia. Not to say that they're wrong, but they didn't quite get to the main difference in terms of the outcomes. Right, so these existing explanations focus either on the structure of the underlying cleavages in the two societies, or the strategic and ideological characteristics of the parties that are contesting power. What these explanations don't get into is the political psychology of how groups and individuals form initially and then update preferences. And in this process, context is important. So most of these existing explanations come from democratic contexts. Here we're talking about polarization that happens under authoritarian conditions. And second, group identities matter, both for the kinds of information that people are being exposed to, and also how they weigh this kind of information. So in short, my argument, and I love my cover, so I had to put a picture of it for you to look at while I say this. In short, my argument is that repression conditions political polarization. Specifically, the context of authoritarianism is doing the work of creating polarization that has these downstream effects for democratization. What I mean by repression in my book, and I'm happy to answer questions about whether this is a fair and exhaustive definition of repression, is state behavior intended to demobilize actors who are challenging regimes. I focus exclusively on physical coercive actions taken by the regime. We can think about, as Tariq has done in some of his books, economic sanctions, etc. But I'm focused on the physical. So arrests, beatings, harassments, targeted assassinations, etc. Things that are very visible in terms of who they're affecting and things that physically affect people. And I do this, in addition to thinking very specifically about what kind of repression I'm talking about. I also think I'm departing from some of the existing literature in this book, in that much of the literature on repression and authoritarian regimes thinks of it as a structural constraint, right? It's shifting political opportunity structures, making certain kinds of behaviors more and less costly in a very rational framework. When we think about what repression actually is as an experience, it's likely to have very different effects, right? These are very traumatic, physically painful things that happen to people, their families, their friends, their communities. So what I'm trying to do here is reconceptualize repression as one of these very influential traumatic events, the stuff that makes up identity. And Christian Davenport has this really nice quote about how focusing on the political opportunity structure implications of repression leaves us in a place where we don't know a lot about what it does at this individual psychological level. So to put this all together, there's multiple arrows here, but I think of this as a two-step process. In the first step, repression conditions identity. And in the second step, identity conditions levels and the nature of political polarization. Let me walk through this a little bit more. So repression here creates or updates identity through three mechanisms. The psychological mechanism, to me, is the most important, and the social and organizational are both things that have been touched on in the literature, and I think kind of play a supporting role to the psychological mechanism. What I mean by psychological here is this idea that when groups are repressed, it reveals information about who else is in your in-group, right? Is it just your in-group, the Muslim Brotherhood, or is it the whole opposition that's being repressed? And this idea of shared trauma somehow revealing, these are people like me. And in the second step, identity, right, the increase in either in-group identification or a supranational or supraordinate identity, then through processes of natural group differentiation, condition the level of political polarization. the kind of repression that exists within a given authoritarian environment matters. So for targeted repression, in my case, this is going to be Egypt, through a psychological mechanism reinforced by a social and organizational mechanism, creates a strengthened in-group identification where in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, this individual group, serves as the basis for that identity. And then as a result of this strengthened in-group identification, the difference, both in affect and in preferences, increases through these processes of group differentiation. In a widespread repressive regime, there's one of two things going on. So first, there's going to be a relative to that targeted repressive environment, in-group identification, and a shifting of identification and a strengthening of identification to a superordinate bridging identity. Here, the opposition. Tunisia, as I mentioned, is a case of this, where groups start to identify more strongly as the Tunisian opposition rather than an individual group, such as Ennahda. As a result, because of the way in which this identity is formed, political polarization is relatively less high than in a place where there's targeted repression. So the book, from wonderful feedback that I received both at MEI and elsewhere, starts essentially at the beginning. So, if we care about the effects of repression, we also need to think about where repression comes from. Why do regimes repress differently? Existing explanations, some by my colleagues in my own department, tend to focus on when autocrats come to power, they look around, they perceive what threats exist, and they construct the appropriate coercive apparatus, right? So they look around, they see either other elites, other institutions, or the masses being particularly threatening, and then they make the appropriate coercive institution to deal with that threat. After that institution is put in place, there's a path dependence. So you get these predictable repressive behaviors over time. But when we look at the historiography of coercive institutions, this is rarely the case, right? That somebody like Nasser comes to power in 1952 and can just create a coercive institution as if there was nothing there. Instead, what I do in chapter 3 of the book is look at where these coercive institutions come from. In my understanding, colonialism is not the be-all and end-all of why we get repression, but it overlaps with a formative period of state building in the Middle East, particularly when it comes to police and intelligence institutions. So again, I'm not disagreeing with this idea of path dependence. It just starts earlier. It starts before independence from the colonial regimes. And here, the variation in repressive environment comes from something exogenous to what exists on the ground. It very much is guided by former colonial interests. And here, I don't mean to, for some of the historians in the audience, I don't mean to suggest that this is just a French-British divide that explains the whole thing, but looking at the interests in terms of French colonizers in Tunisia and British colonizers in Egypt, we do see that there are very different interests at play. And I'm happy to talk more about this in the book. I go into why Algeria looks very different under the French. So again, not just this distinct binary between French and British. It can vary within these different kinds of colonizers. I argue that the French have a very specific mission in colonizing the Middle East, and they create specific coercive institutions that go along with that mission. So they collect a lot of information. It tends not to be very good information. They create lower quality intelligence, less penetrative coercive intelligence collections institutions. As a result, because of this low quality intelligence, you get reactive use of repression and a more violent coercive apparatus. And what I do in the book is start under the French and then look using historical sources at how these things persist through 1956 in Tunisia. And very much has this predictive, very consistent pattern of repression through both the Bourguiba and the Ben Ali regime. Meanwhile, in Egypt, we have the British, and they are very much motivated by economic and strategic interests. They are relative to the French in Tunisia, creating higher quality intelligence institutions. They use things like informants. They're actually able to distinguish between both real threats and non-real threats. As a result, you get a preemptive use of repression, a targeted type of repression, and an overall less violent state towards its opposition. So the regimes that I'm looking at in the 1980s inherit these coercive institutions. This is why they repress differently. And what ends up happening is that, in the way that the French put in place a widespread repressive regime and the British put in place a targeted repressive regime in Egypt, we see these regimes doing the same sort of thing, both in the 50s, 60s, 70s, but also when these new autocrats come to power in the 80s. So in Tunisia, my case of a widespread repressive regime, between 1987 and 2011, there were about 30,000 political prisoners. And what's interesting is that there were these overlapping waves of repression against the opposition that resulted in having all of these groups in both jails and in exile at the same time. So first, the Islamists, become the first target of the regime. They do very well in a 1989 election. And between 1989 and 1991, between 8,000 and 10,000 Islamists are arrested and jailed. In 1991, coinciding with the Gulf War, the regime starts to go after leftist parties. This continues for just over a decade. And then finally, in 1997, the regime starts to go after both center-left parties, as well as personal enemies of the Trabelsi family, so the Ben Ali's wife's family. What's important about this in terms of what widespread repression means for these different opposition groups is that they're being treated very similarly by the regime. They're sharing spaces, as I mentioned, both in exile, mostly in Europe, and in prisons. And they start to create bridging structures, right? All of these different groups are being affected by repression. And so what they tend to do is focus on these, bridging identities, these bridging institutions that focus on things like human rights abuses rather than individual political issues. Meanwhile, in Egypt, again, about 30,000 political prisoners. The demographics of this population is very different from that of Tunisia, where you get kind of a representative pluralist political prisoner population. In Egypt, for the most part, it's targeted against the Muslim Brotherhood. The regime is repressing the Brotherhood at regular intervals around these national elections in 1995, 2000, 2005, 2010. Again, in terms of the experience for the opposition, targeted repression means that groups know and feel like they're being treated differently. They're being held in different spaces, whether that's in prison versus outside of prison, but also within prisons, being held in different parts of the prison complexes. And a wonderful scholar, Khalil Anani, has shown how targeted repression has over time made the Brotherhood a much more defensive structure, right? It's a group under siege turning in on itself. In my argument, this results then in different kinds of polarization that I track over time. In Tunisia, a widespread repressive regime results in more positive affect among the opposition. They think much more positively about each other. They have each other's phone numbers. When I do research in Tunisia in 2013, they have very interesting stories about meeting other members of the opposition in prison or being Muslim exiles in Europe and having certain kinds of experiences there. Importantly, this also means that they find agreement on the role of religion in politics. Remember that salient cleavage that I mentioned being important after 2011. And they find this agreement before 2010, right? So there's two major agreements, 70 to 80% of those agreements about where and how religion will be codified in a new state, a democratic state, should the opposition succeed. 70 to 80% of that document ends up in the constitution 3 years after the revolution. Meanwhile, in Egypt, there's increasingly negative affect among the opposition, very vitriolic rhetoric against each other, and also the accusation that the other side is working with the regime to punish, in this case, the Brotherhood. And increasingly, there's also a disagreement on the role of religion in politics. This is mostly driven by the Brotherhood's strengthening preferences for having a stronger role of religion in the constitution should there be democratization. If you think back to my flowchart of my theory, what I argue is that this happens through identity. So repression conditions polarization through identity. In Tunisia, you have this creation of a bridging identity where people are focusing on themselves as members of a democratic opposition instead of just a member of their individual opposition group. In Egypt, the opposite is happening, right? So for the targeted group, in this case, the Muslim Brotherhood, repression is strengthening that in-group identification. And there's very much this strengthening of a victimized and unique Muslim Brotherhood identity versus a broader opposition. The last part of the book then talks about how this polarization, as conditioned in my cases over 30 to 60 years of repression, complicates the democratic process. And specifically, it complicates compromise and cooperation, the central aspects of contingency, on three really key aspects of democratic transition. There's a fourth that Juan Linz and a co-author talks about in terms of foreign policy. I don't talk a lot about that, but I'd be interested to perhaps talk about this more with Tark during the Q&A. What I show is that higher levels of polarization makes it very difficult to draft a new constitution, schedule and run first elections, and create a framework for transitional justice. In Tunisia, as I mentioned, a new constitution, again, not an easy task, right, to undo 60 years of authoritarianism. Within 3 years, the Tunisian opposition is able to draft and pass a constitution that everyone can live with. And they do so in a very pluralistic manner, right? It's not just about power sharing at the top. There's actually power sharing reflecting the electoral results within each constitutional committee, drafting each constitutional amendment. Tunisia, since 2014, has had a number of national and municipal elections in a way that suggests that the democratization that's happened at the national level is starting to trickle down to a much more local level. And importantly, even though there were initially some disagreements about the nature of elections and the timing of elections, everyone agreed to them and continues to agree to them. Finally, Tunisia had a frankly remarkable Truth and Justice Commission. Over the course of 8 years, the Truth and Justice Commission collected over 60,000 complaints against the former state of economic and other kinds of disenfranchisement, repression. There was a remarkable and very moving final ceremony that was broadcast on national television. And what's important here for my argument is that this was possible because it wasn't a political issue, right? When you have nearly every family, every kind of opposition group being affected by repression, it becomes kind of a national reconciliation process rather than, as we'll see in Egypt, a very politicized, one-sided process. So in Egypt, I mentioned the December 2012 constitution. Since then, there's been a reversion to, basically the same authoritarian constitution that's existed since 1971. Although it's been strengthened, Sisi might stay in power through 2030. In terms of elections, there was a lot of disagreement about the timing and the nature of these first elections. Secular opposition, due to this polarization, was really unhappy with having early elections that both in terms of the timing and in terms of the format really favored the Brotherhood in their opinion. And then finally, there's no transitional justice. In the case of Egypt, had that process gone forward, it would have been very much a process that perhaps favored or acknowledged that the Brotherhood had gotten it worse under the previous regime. So to kind of summarize what I'm hoping people will take away from the book, I hope there's three main contributions. So first, I'm hoping that scholars will rethink what repression is. It's not just the structural constraint. It's very much this lived traumatic experience, right, that has all these implications for people's bodies, for their families, for the development of their lives. And beyond that, who is sharing in this repressive experience? All the psychology on shared trauma suggests that this really matters. And it can be a very powerful and painful way in which, the state is being violent towards people and shaping political outcomes. Second, what I think I do in the book is look at, contingency, which we know is important, right? The ability of elites to make the right decisions at the right times, and often at moments of heightened passion and immense consequence, that matters, right, to keep democracy on track. What I'm trying to do is look at the micro foundations of some of these less than rational allegiances and identities that contribute to how people make decisions during this process. And finally, I hope I encourage other scholars to look at applying political psychology outside of the American context. I think it's not the easiest thing to do, but I think it's extremely fruitful in thinking through, in the words of the actors themselves, why people are doing what they're doing outside of a rational framework. So with that in mind, I have lots of other slides, but I want to turn to Tarek to guide our conversation. And thank you all so much again. This has been a really weird year to have a book come out, so I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk to you about my work.
Oh, thank you so much, Liz. And though this has been a pretty crummy year for most of us, it has been a year made less crummy by the fact that we got to read your book. So thank you. So I'm going to abuse my position just a little bit, and you and I will chat, and then we'll open it up to the audience. And so first, what I want to do is I just want to make sure that I restate the argument as clearly and as concisely as possible. And so the basic fact that you're trying to explain is that in Egypt, after the democratic transition was initiated, the opposition, which we can describe in stylized fashion as being composed of Islamists and quote unquote liberals or non-Islamists, that opposition was unable to cooperate. And consequently, they were not able to cement a democratic transition. The military was able to step in and take over. Whereas in Tunisia, the Islamists and non-Islamists were able to cooperate. And that difference, you say, is actually attributable to the different types of repression that we observe in each country during the authoritarian period. In the Egyptian case, the regime was oppressing mainly Islamists. You had what Ellen Lust calls a divided structure of contestation. The Islamists got the brunt of regime repression, and consequently, they developed a very strong corporate identity such that when we entered into the democratic period, they weren't really open to working with others. They were all about themselves. They had a very strong in-group identity and great suspicion of the out-group. In the Tunisian case, you had a much more evenly distributed repression. Everybody got bonked on the head by the authoritarian regime. And so consequently, the identity that was formed there was the identity of being in opposition to authoritarianism. And then you tell us, well, where did that come from? It came from colonialism. The French were trying to do different things in their colonial period. Consequently, they developed the kind of coercive apparatus that repressed everybody, and that was inherited by Bourguiba and Bourguiba's successor, Ben Ali, and they just continued in that French mode of repression. And in the Egyptian case, we had the more chic British style of repression, less violent, more targeted, etc. And that explains the pattern of repression that we observe in Egypt. First question is, so I'm trying to figure out, who do I blame for what went wrong in Egypt? And I could read this book and I could blame one of two groups, okay? The first group I could blame is the Islamists. I could say, really what Liz describes here, gives here, is an explanation for why the Islamists were such jerks and so unwilling to cooperate with others, because they just had a very strong sense of themselves and their righteousness, etc. So that would be one way in which I could deploy this argument. The other way in which I could deploy this argument is saying, actually, no, what she's doing is absolving the Islamists, because this is really all about colonialism. And we could have predicted the outcome by just looking at the repressive strategies of these colonial powers in the 1940s and 50s and before. Which of these are you more likely to endorse?
I don't want to blame anyone for anything, but I do think there's, perhaps it takes some of the intentionality away from both, it takes some of the intentionality away from Islamists, right? I do think what the book shows is that Islamists are very much a function of the environment that they're in, right? There's something about the experiences that they have that make them more and less likely to cooperate with other groups. And so I think, in terms of blaming the Islamists, they grew up in a certain kind of repressive environment, and I'm not sure they would have been able to be more cooperative in the post-2011 period in Egypt. In terms of blaming the British, so I'm, increasingly still trying to work on this empirically. It's really difficult to find the right kinds of data to prove this argument. I do think some of the policing and coercive and intelligence collecting institutions, all of which are related, right? The level of intelligence and the quality of intelligence determines how repressive and how well or targeted repressive a regime can be. These things really matter, right? In terms of creating states that are functioning, but also that create certain dynamics that might have these long-term unintended consequences in terms of essentially being set up to fail in different ways. So probably you blame everybody a little bit, but also think these structures really matter for creating actors that behave in certain ways. Under these, as you've written about in your book, actors still have some choice, but there's structured contingency here. These groups are operating in specific environments that are not of their choosing.
Yeah. No, I think I appreciate that. So, I love this book. I love this argument. I think it just is introducing an incredibly important omitted variable to our understanding of the divergent outcomes in these two countries. So I think this is just awesome. I will say, okay, so there's a couple of questions I have about the underlying social realities that you describe. And, I think if, sort of the first question would be about this question of continuity. The almost telescopic nature of the argument that we are attributing something that happens in 2012, 2013 to stuff that happened in the first half of the 20th century. And this idea that the coercive apparatuses of these countries are just the inheritances from the colonial period. And I'm wondering if that's an accurate description of reality. I don't know much about the police. I know a little bit more about another big part of the coercive apparatus, which is the military. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we would say, for example, that the Egyptian military is, that it's the inheritance of what you had during the British colonial period. Hazem Pandil said, under the British, Egypt's army was a parade ground army. And then when Abdel Nasser comes and, the army becomes expanded. So, what are the conditions under which a post-colonial regime will decide to just carry on with the practices of the prior colonial power, as you're saying they did with the police, or will decide to break decisively with the practices of the previous colonial power, as they did with the army in the Egyptian case?
Yeah, well, I think you're pointing to a really important distinction that has to be made in the coercive institutions literature. Often people talk about the military as if that is the group the military matters on a number of different levels, right? But the military matters in terms of repression at this elite level, right? The group that is, or the institution that's doing the regular repression of authoritarian regimes is actually the police, right? The military only gets called out in both Egypt and Tunisia 3 or 4 times over the course of independence. And so I think what you see, and again, this is in some ways an important part of the book, but not my main argument. So I will defer to real historians on this. What I've observed in the budget data from Egypt is that the Egyptian state spends a lot of time remaking its military, but not its police, right? And that seems to be something that happens across these independent states, right? They had a very robust policing institution because that's what had been important to colonial apparatus, the colonial, apparatus, the colonial strategy of control. What they didn't have was standing armies that could defend them, both against, internal, kind of regional internal armies, but also against colonial regimes, right? So I think, my somewhat informed opinion would be the policing institutions were much more robust than independence, and they stay in place much more than some of the other coercive institutions, particularly the military. And I think, I don't think independent regimes are necessarily making choices, but in terms of when they can depart, I think a large influx of cash, right, of some sort, allows them to remake these institutions. It's very costly, both politically, but also, actually very costly to start a military, to get enough people paid to be in a military, to train them. So I think, that's a potential condition under which there could be a really decisive break between the colonial period and the independence period.
Yeah. I mean, one question obviously is, to what extent is the difference that you identify between the Egyptian pattern of repression and the Tunisian pattern of repression as sharp as you make it out to be? I think about Gamal Abdel Nasser, and when Gamal Abdel Nasser first shows up, one of the first things that he does, which a lot of people don't remember, I mean, scholars of Egypt, of course, remember it, is, he executes two leftist Labor Party leaders for leading a labor strike in Kafr Dawar, which is in the north of the country. You would have to look at Gamal Abdel Nasser's coercive apparatus and conclude that it was highly violent, as you described the Tunisian one as being, and quite broad in terms of the victims of that violence. I mean, it was after 54, it's Islamists, it's leftists, everybody spent time in Gamal Abdel Nasser's prisons. So that would seem to suggest much more commonality with the pattern that you observe in Tunisia. And that means that the change to the pattern we observe in Hosni Mubarak's era happens much later.
Yeah, I think this is another important distinction that, again, is a little bit outside of the book's argument, but I think is an interesting one. I do think in all of these cases, there's like these moments of consolidation, right? So Nasser in the 1950s is consolidating, and you do see more repression during that period. Other scholars have identified this as a tactic, right? When you're trying to, after a regime change, get people to buy in, there's a lot of repression. But if we look at Nasser, over time, his biggest opposition and his biggest target was the Brotherhood, right? It's the Mehna period. There's very public executions of Brotherhood leaders. You do see under Sadat, right, a shifting from the Brotherhood to the leftists. So you can shift targets. There's some agency there. But when I kind of step back and look at Egypt from, the 10,000-foot level, over time, starting with the British, there is a targeted repressive regime, and there are certainly deviations. One that I exploit in the book in 1981, after Sadat's death, or prior to his death.
Right before he died.
Yeah, there's this roundup of both Islamists and secularists. It actually, for my argument, is really interesting because there is this moment where these people are integrated, they're with each other in prison, and they think much more positively about each other, at least briefly, right? So I think, that is all to say, I'm stepping back, not looking at an individual regime or year. And when I look at kind of the pattern of repression, there's much more continuity in the way that these regimes repress over time. And again, this is, I think I said Bruce Hoffman before, but I meant Bruce, who's that Colgate?
Bruce Rutherford.
Rutherford has talked about whether or not the Sisi regime is Mubarak 2.0 or a new kind of authoritarianism. And I think his work is brilliant, and he's done some really, I know he gave a talk at MEI recently, which was, or recently 3 years ago, which was great. I think there's a question of like, is Sisi consolidating after the disruption that was 2011, 2012, 2013, right? So he is being highly repressive, more than just the targeted repressive regime we would expect in Egypt. Or is he reinstitutionalizing a new kind of regime, right? He's building new prisons. He's going to potentially bankrupt, the state in doing some of this. I think that's potentially a question too.
Yeah, no, I definitely see that as a question. I mean, if you had, asked me in 2009 to describe the coercive environment in Tunisia, I'm not sure I would have described it as one that is evenly coercive. I mean, the Islamists were definitely much more excluded from that system than the quote unquote secularists, many of whom had legal opposition parties and were able to operate in the country. So there's a little bit, there's a little bit of a residual question there. I guess the other question is, you do a wonderful job of describing this affective polarization that existed in the Egyptian case and the absence of it in Tunisia. And, I will stipulate, you've forgotten more about Tunisia than I will ever know. But in my interactions with Tunisians, I have been struck by just how negatively Tunisian secularists think of Tunisian Islamists. And on the other side of this story, if you look at the Egyptian case, we can find many episodes of relative comity between Egyptian secularists and Egyptian Islamists. If you go back and think of that National Association for Change, the movement known as Kifaya or Enough, that was led by a secularist, Abdel Halim Andil, and an Islamist, Magdi Hussein. And, in fact, when Magdi Hussein wanted to run for I think to be Secretary General or something of Kifaya, this was in January of 2011, and he was in prison. Abdel Halim Qandil is the guy who comes out and says that he totally supports it. And he analogizes Magdi Hussein to Nelson Mandela. And then, of course, fast forward a year or 2 years later, and of course, they're on opposite sides of this very deep divide. So again, how much of the situational, of the cleavage is really situational? And before you answer it, let me give you an alternative hypothesis, and you tell me why this is wrong, as it almost certainly is. Okay, so why isn't the answer much simpler, which is that after the veil of ignorance is lifted by the founding elections in Tunisia and Egypt, you have very different outcomes. You said Islamists get 37% in both countries. Not exactly true. In Tunisia, they get 37%. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood gets 37%. And then you have the Hizb an-Nur, which gets about 27%. Together, they're at 65% of the vote. Islamists get 65% of the vote in the Egyptian case. So if I'm a Tunisian secularist, I'm saying, well, the Islamists definitely are a plurality, but the majority of the vote went to non-Islamists. And in fact, Hizb Harakat al-Nahda, the Islamist party, had to ally with secularist parties in order to constitute a majority and form the government. And so if I'm a secularist, I'm not that, to use a technical term, freaked out.
Mm-hmm.
We actually can do quite well electorally. The issue for us is coordination. In the Egyptian case, I see the Islamists have basically won close to a supermajority. In fact, in terms of seats, they did win a supermajority. And consequently, I'm extremely nervous. And I may be thinking democracy is a mug's game. It's just a delivery system for Islamist governments. And so I am much more likely to go and, to use the late Al Stepan's evocative phrase, knock on the barracks door to say, military, please come deliver me from this Islamist deluge. Why isn't that what's going on here?
Yeah, well, and I think I initially got this citation from you a very long time ago, but this, I think it's an Ian Shapiro idea that like most big social historical processes are not monocausal, right? So I will concede that there is more than one thing going on here. And I think, that's a really important observation that you have. I would say that the outcomes are a function of electoral laws that Islamists had to agree to ahead of time, right? So the fact that Islamists in Tunisia do have to abide by a troika government and form a unity government were terms that they agreed to before the elections happened, right? In terms of the process of getting to those elections. So I don't know if that totally undermines, what I'm saying. I think the whole process, it's not just the electoral outcomes, it's also the rules that Islamists put in place to bind themselves, right? In both cases, Islamists were going to do very well. And, the fact that in Tunisia, they did agree to these elections that were a little bit later, right, than they had initially wanted them. They were a little bit more proportional than they had initially wanted them. In Egypt, you don't have that same approach during that period before we really know what the outcome is going to be of those elections.
So again, you know way more about Tunisian history than I do. We only have till 3, so I want to let other people get in here. As I recall, the Nahda party actually pulled out of the that body that was in charge of deciding things like the electoral law because they were so annoyed. The electoral law that you had in Tunisia, which was the PR with the hair quota, is what you ended up having for 2/3 of the seats in Egypt. And if we just look at the electoral results from the PR tier in Egypt, you still get the same outcome, Islamist supermajority.
Yeah.
The interesting thing, another way in which these two systems, these two polities are different right after the Arab Spring is, the way you put it, the opposition was in charge of the transition. That's certainly true in Tunisia. That Higher Council for the Fulfillment of Revolutionary Goals and Political Reform and something else, that was an opposition-led body, absolutely. Egypt, it was led by the military.
Right.
So I guess, again, I mean, I think the question that I'm going to keep on asking you is, I am completely sold on affective polarization. My question is it really all the way back to colonialism that we have to look in order to explain it? Or is it much more in what happens in those founding elections when the losing side in Egypt, the liberals, realize they are truly an electoral cipher, non-entity?
Right.
Whereas in Tunisia, they're like, oh, we're pretty good. And then maybe we have to explain that difference with reference to something that happened in the authoritarian period. But then we're looking at, well, why do Islamists win a supermajority in Egypt? And why don't they win a supermajority in Tunisia? Did Bourguiba have something to do with it, et cetera?
Right. And I think Hisham Salam's work on this, the decimation of the left under late Nasser, early Sadat is important to think about too.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I think there's definitely something to what you're saying. And in terms of, I do think part of what's important about the secularists in Egypt losing to the Brotherhood is that they, in terms of both affective and preference polarization, they only fear the Brotherhood because they have this vitriol and they have this disagreement, right? I mean, if they were less polarized, it would have been less threatening to watch the Brotherhood win. So I think that adds to maybe the threat of having the Brotherhood win and waiting 4 years, if not longer, right, to have them allowed to contest again.
It's hard for us to remember this, but right after the revolution, or as the revolution was going on, if you talked to Egyptians who were non-Islamist, their affection for the Muslim Brotherhood was actually quite high. I remember talking to somebody who's very concerned with the Coptic community. And I said, aren't you worried? The Muslim Brotherhood seemed to be in some kind of pole position here. And said, no, they're excellent. They're being wonderful, etc. So, there was a period of much more comity. Okay, I'm going to shut up now.
Wait, can I just add to that? Have you read Walter Ambrose?
I have, yes.
I think his description of, I think the revolution everywhere was this unifying drug for at least the 18 days, maybe not even all the 18 days, but I think there's something really powerful about those negative coalitions that fall apart pretty quickly almost everywhere, but there's something really magical about those days of protest that you don't want to lose.
Yeah, that's interesting. How do you bottle that and keep it